Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Frank Chapman. I'm obviously one of the pilots here. Our wonderful Westland Lysander you see behind me, we've had it here for quite some time now. I think it came to us about 15 years or so ago after a rebuild over at Duxford. I think most of us who fly it, it's certainly one of the highlights of the collection. It's got a nice big engine, the Bristol Mercury engine, which powers also the Gladiator and the Blenheim. So nice powerful engine, radial engine with a propeller that interestingly, because it's a fairly early aeroplane from the sort of Second World War period, it has a variable pitch propeller, but it's only two-position variable pitch. So we set it fine, which means the angle of the propeller blades to the air is quite small for the takeoff. It gives us more acceleration down the runway. But once we're airborne, we can coarsen off the blades. So we've got a little plunger that we pull, and it coarsens off the blade, so we get a better performance from the propeller in the cruise. So when we take off for the display, we take off with it fine. Once I'm airborne, I select it to course, and then I run the whole display in course, pretty much with a fixed power setting. There's enough energy there and power that I can just run at a constant RPM and just concentrate on the positioning on the airfield, and obviously monitoring the engine temperatures and pressures and so forth. But it behaves itself. It tends to run a little bit warm, so we have to be a little bit careful when we start up and taxi out, because we have a very strict temperature limit on the ground, and it gets up to that temperature limit, particularly on a hot day like today, quite quickly. So you'll see for the flight this morning, we did the engine runs down by the end of the runway, so that the taxi was relatively quick. As soon as the engine starts, we taxi off down to the end of the runway, do our engine runs before the temperature gets too high. Once we're airborne, of course, there's a lot of air flowing through that engine, and it keeps it cool. So, but we obviously, these engines are getting very old now, and we need to keep them going for many years to come. So we have to really baby the engines to make them last for many years. This particular one you see has got what we call cowl flaps, which drives even more air through the engine. These are the cowl flaps here. We can adjust them in the air. So on a cold day, we could keep them closed. On a hot day like today, we'll have them fully open to get the maximum air through the engine past the cylinder heads there. And also running the aeroplane on a constant power setting, it keeps all the temperatures constant. It makes the engine last as best we can, really. Obviously, we still have to give it a breakdown every so often just to check that it's in good state. But we get good service out of it if we keep everything running nice and smoothly, constant temperatures, and not shock loading the engine. So, and that's true of in fact, the whole fleet of aircraft here at Borden. The other thing that's obviously interesting about this aeroplane is it used to fly from a little airfield called Thamesford, which is just up the A1 from here. It's only, in this aeroplane, it's 5 minutes from here. So often if we go and practice up there just to get back into the swing of it. We don't fly these aeroplanes very much, so over the years we've flown them a lot. The displays normally are only 5 or 10 minutes. We don't really get a lot of practice, so quite often you'll see us disappear just to get a feel for the aeroplane again before we come back and actually do the display, because we're not flying it really that often. This one's particularly interesting because it has automatic flaps and slats. You can see the slats out on the leading edges of the wing and the flaps at the back. Now I don't have to touch anything. That sets itself so at the angle of the aeroplane sits on the ground. When I start to accelerate down the runway, even if they were closed, and you can close them manually, they would pop open because of the force of the air driving at the wing. And then as I take off and accelerate, as the angle of attack on the wing decreases, as I accelerate faster and faster, they automatically come in. So I don't have to worry about them. And the same on the approach. As I come around the final turn and slow the aeroplane down, those just pop out all by themselves. They come out all together, and then I can adjust to the approach speed for the final landing. Its handling is, for an aeroplane, it looks a big aeroplane. It's actually a lot lighter than you might imagine when you see the size of it, because most of it is tubular and fabric construction. It's a big hollow tube. So it looks big, but actually there's not a lot of weight there. So it's quite light, but it's got quite a big wing, so it's quite heavy in roll. You can see the ailerons are quite small. They're only sort of probably half span, just maybe a bit less. So it's a bit sluggish to roll. which makes it a little bit more challenging flying the air display, because it's not like the Gladiator, which you can throw around quite nicely. This one takes a bit more time and anticipation. But it's fairly straightforward to fly. It comes off the ground. It's not like a classic tailwheel aeroplane where you bring the power up slowly, which you have to do with this one, and you let the tail come off the ground, and then you just keep it accelerating until you get flying speed and then bring it off the ground. This one, you effectively come off the ground with all three wheels on the ground. So there's no change, there's no lifting the tail. It's just apply the power, keep it straight. It will come off the ground when it's fully ready to come off the ground. And then from that point, you then fly it away, trim it and accelerate, and away you go. And similarly on the landing, when you're in the cockpit, you're sitting quite high, but the visual cues from the way that the cockpit is designed, I've got effectively a bar across the front of the instrument panel, and I can use that to know as I'm coming in to land when I've got exactly that position, three wheels on the ground position. So I keep it flying just above the ground until I see that picture. When I see that picture, I know if I just don't touch anything, it'll settle on the three wheels. If I've got it a bit wrong and I'm a bit fast, it might bounce a little bit, but generally this one is pretty good. The undercarriage absorbs any shock, and it just sits nicely on the ground. And it's actually, because the wheels are relatively far apart, it's not bad in a crosswind, to be honest. It's not one of these airplanes that's likely to disappear off the side of the runway at a heartbeat, which some of our airplanes do. So it's good. But it has a pneumatic brake system, which the Gladiator does as well, and a lot of those early airplanes. In fact, even the Hawker Hunter has pneumatic brakes. It was typical of airplanes really right up to the 50s, and the problem with them is they fade quite quickly. So if you get them hot, and this one, because it's got this, the wheel is actually enclosed, there's nowhere for the heat to go, so they heat up quite quickly. And when they heat up, then the brakes don't work, and that doesn't help you taxi in. The tank underneath is just cosmetic. It was a long-range fuel tank, doesn't have anything in it now. It's just an empty shell. In fact, I think that was a replica that was built to make it look like the airplanes that they used to take and send over to France with the spies during the Second World War. And I have to say, having flown it quite regularly now, I take my hat off to the guys that actually did this for real in the dark and landing in farmers' fields in southern France, because it's not the easiest aeroplane to land, and if you can't see where the ground is, it makes it twice as difficult. So I know they had a few little glim lights to follow, but it wouldn't have been particularly easy. But in the cruise for long distance navigation, it's actually a delight because it's very stable. It sits there. It's quite a high-speed aeroplane, surprisingly enough. So with the slats in, the flaps up, and the engine at a reasonable intermediate power setting, it cruises along at about 150 miles an hour, maybe a bit more. Yeah, I could imagine going quite a long way, quite comfortably. It's a nice big cockpit. There's lots of room. And interestingly enough, when you're sat there at the right position, with your head at the right position, the seat's adjustable, your head is actually right along the leading edge of the wing. So although you would think you couldn't see very much because the wing's in the way, actually the wing is quite thin. So you can look above it or you can look below it, and the visibility is actually extremely good. We never fly it with anybody in the back, or we haven't for a very, very long time. I mean, we could potentially, but obviously there's the ladder for the guys getting in and out quickly, as they would have done during the Second World War. And the cockpit at the back is quite big as well. But for training, we don't need to train on it as such. Most of the pilots are pretty experienced, so we just give them a briefing of what the peculiarities are with this aeroplane, and I suppose whenever we fly any of these airplanes for the first time, though the pilot might be experienced, he needs to know where the pitfalls are, where the problems or potential problems are. And this one has several. The first, starting with the front, the engine, it's very susceptible to, it will stop if you pump the throttle. So you've got to be very gentle with the power. There's a lot of inertia in the engine, and there's a fuel pump which will push too much fuel too quickly into the engine, and it'll just stop. So you can't afford to be quick on the power, even if you want to go around. So everything has to be anticipated. It doesn't like negative G, so if you push the stick forward, and as if you're going over a humpback ridge, you get that feeling, the engine will stop. So that's the second thing you've got to be very, very careful about. And it's very susceptible to icing. Now today we've got no problem, so I don't bother with the carburettor heating system. It has a carburettor heating system, and any day that there is dew on the ground, a little bit of cloud, humidity is a little bit higher than it is today, then we run with the carburettor heat hot unless we're at full power, because it is prone to icing, and icing will stop the engine. So there are 3 gotchas with the engine that we briefed the guys. In terms of flying, the other big gotcha is that it's got a very, very powerful trimming system for those of you that have flown aeroplanes. Depending on the speed of the aeroplane, we set the trim, which basically sets the geometry of the tailplane up with respect to the wing, so that you can effectively fly hands off. And so if you're flying cross country, once you've got the speed right, the trim right, you can effectively just adjust the aeroplane so that if you want to pick up a map, you can let go of the stick and it's not going to suddenly veer off to one side. It will just go straight. It's pretty stable. But if you want to change speeds, so if you want to slow down to an approach speed, for example, the amount of trim that you have to put in is significant. And on the back, you can see in front of the leading edge of the tailplane, there are a couple of positions. There's an up position, down position, and a takeoff position. And because the propeller is throwing air over the tailplane, it's creating a big pitching moment, and if the takeoff trim is not set, then you can get to the stage where you physically can't hold the aeroplane. It will pitch up until it stalls and crashes. So it's absolutely imperative that the pilots, when they take off this aeroplane, have that trim set to takeoff position. And people have died in the past because they haven't done it. So what we do here is we say, right, well, when we do the engine run-ups, which invariably we do at the end of the runway, the engineers are briefed. Before they take the chocks out from the aeroplane, they check that that is at the takeoff position. As a double check for us that we've correctly set it. Now we go through our checklist as well, but they check it as well, because the last thing we want is obviously to go off with the airplane not set for takeoff. But it has a similar implication on the landing, because if you make your approach and you're trimmed for the approach and everything is nice and stable, you're on the right approach speed and you're coming down and suddenly something happens on the runway and you need to go around, as you apply power, you're getting all that prop wash over that back end of the aeroplane, and it's set for a very low speed because you're coming in the approach. So as the aeroplane accelerates, it pitches up, and again, you physically haven't got the strength to hold the aeroplane nose down if you don't do something with the trim. So the technique with this aeroplane is to apply a little bit of power, a little bit of trim, a little bit of power, a little bit of trim, until you get to the go-around power setting. So it's a very gradual process. And as it happens, that's better for the engine anyway, because it allows the engine slowly to accelerate to higher speed, higher temperature, etc. So they're really the big gotchas with this aeroplane. Otherwise, it's actually a very nice aeroplane to fly. We're all very privileged, obviously, to fly the aeroplanes here, and this one is certainly one of our favourites.